Welcome. Today is Tuesday, the 23rd of June, 2015, and a beautiful sunny morning here in North Idaho, and I'm joined on the line by John Medaille, a professor at the University of Dallas, and the author of two books, The Vocation of Business and Towards a Truly Free Market, as well as many writings and periodicals as diverse as the Remnant and Res Publica. John, thank you for joining me today.
Ryan, thank you for having me.
How did you get started writing about economics and teaching? I believe you teach in theology, right?
I teach in the theology department at the University of Dallas, yes. Well, actually it happened by accident, like all good things do. I was actually a businessman, and I was taking an advanced degree in theology at the University of Dallas when they decided to establish a course in Catholic social teaching for business students. And they wanted a businessman to teach that course. Unfortunately, with what they paid, they couldn't get a real businessman, so they asked me to put the course together. And I was actually working on other areas, but I thought, well, this shouldn't be difficult. I'll just get the textbook and teach it. Well, it turns out there was no textbook to teach the social encyclicals to business students. Was rather an odd circumstance. 100 years after Rerum Novarum, there were books for economists, there were books for theologians, but there were no books for business students. So I ended up having to write my own text, and that's what got me started on it. And then, it's like a bad habit. Once you start writing books, it's almost as bad as smoking. It's just hard to stop.
So today, how did you get started in Distributist, though? Were you always of that mindset, or did you have to come to it a bit later?
No, I kind of grew up with Chesterton. I got that from my father. So that was, as we might say, in the blood.
Excellent. So a lot of people, when they first hear the word distributism, the first thing that comes to mind is redistribute. You want to redistribute our wealth around a bit here. So what exactly is distributism, and where does it get its name?
Yes. Well, it gets its name largely from the idea which was abandoned in modern economics, the idea of distributive justice. The idea of distributive justice, one of the two classes of justice, distributive and commutative justice. But distributive justice is the justice involved in distributing the output of some enterprise, a state, a business, a family, etc., to the members of that enterprise. And it's based on justice in this case, states that the distribution of the output must be proportional to the contribution to producing that output. So that's distributive justice. So if, those who contribute more should get more, and those who contribute less should get less. As opposed to commutative justice, which deals with exchanges between individuals, where the justice is in having equal values before and after the trade. So you get a dollar's worth of bread for $1, a day's work for a day's pay. That kind of arithmetic justice. But for the distributists, they noted, along with everybody else, that in fact the people who contributed most to producing the wealth were not getting enough to support themselves. Or had to do so only by working long hours, by living in poverty, by putting their family members out to work, and by living on credit. So there was an obvious violation of distributive justice. But what further distinguishes distributism and the approach to poverty that you find in Rerum Novarum is it's not so much the distribution of income that's important, but the distribution of productive property. Capitalism concentrates productive property in a few hands. And this always leads not to a free market, but to a highly controlled market, a market of oligarchs. And one of the biggest confusions today is confusing capitalism with free markets. they're not the same thing. As a matter of fact, they're mortal enemies. Wherever you get capitalism, markets consolidate until there's only one or two or three players in any important market, and the market gets cartelized. It gets divided into cartels, which is the exact opposite of a free market. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the problems that distributism attempts to solve.
Excellent. So, in history, is there a point where we can say capitalism actually began?
Well, yeah, there's a number of theories on that, but all the theories will trace it back to the Middle Ages. Depending upon who you listen to, the 15th, the 16th, or the 17th century, for Amintore Fanfani, it begins in northern Italy with the Medicis and fallen away Catholics in that area.
Well, the Italians are always claiming the Medici started, virtually everything. So,
well, in this case, they have a really good claim to that. And then, E. Michael Jones and the German Sombart will claim that it starts with the Jews at about the same time. Max Weber with the Calvinists, and then Belloc will attribute it to the breakup of the monasteries and the consolidation of capital in England in 1535. So now there's something to all of those theories, but I think we can definitely say that it's. I think the most reasonable theory is Fanfani's, which puts it with the Medicis and all of those northern Italian cities in about the 14th or 15th century.
Fanfani, in fact, went on to try to delineate the capitalist spirit. What is it that makes up the capitalist mind? That makes it distinguished from, say, what we call distributism or other economic theories of the day. So what can we say is the capitalist spirit?
Well, I think it's acquisition. It's that it's the idea that growth as an end in itself, rather than growth that serves some other end. Acquisition as an end in itself. I think what it is and this is what you'll see, this profound confusion you'll see in every capitalist theory, is a confusion of means and ends. So instead of economics being about what it is, the material provisioning of society, those human relationships we need to enjoy a comfortable life, which is the prerequisite, by the way, for the practice of the virtuous life. Instead of being a means to this end, it becomes an end in itself. And this confusion of means and ends always leads to distortions, and the particular distortions is a pure acquisitive spirit, where you can never be happy, you never have enough, because there is no enough. There is no satisfaction. There's only dissatisfaction that you haven't got more. So that, I think, is the capitalist spirit.
Indeed. And, of course, you see that with different mergers. You look at someone like Bill Gates. He doesn't need anything else. I mean, in fact, he was interviewed once where he said, after the first million or billion, whatever it is, you can't buy anything anymore. So then you just want to, do good for the world, or as we actually see, influence the direction of events towards zero population or whatever he's on now. So, if you can't acquisition anything materially, then you still have that desire to acquisition it socially, I suppose.
Right. Power replaces money as a goal, because money ceases to have any meaning. I mean, this, by the way, is an economic problem. It's called the velocity of money, and this is probably a distraction. But when wealth is widely distributed, money has a high velocity, and by velocity we mean the number of times a dollar changes hands in a given accounting period. So if you give $1 to a poor man, he immediately takes it to lunch. Okay, the money moves very quickly.
Right.
If you give me $1, now at my age, I don't have children in the house. that money takes a long vacation in my pocket before it gets spent. And if you give it to Bill Gates, he doesn't know what the hell to do with it. He has no need for it. So money moves very slowly through the hands of the rich, very quickly through the hands of the poor. And this has, the velocity of money is one of those economic indicators that they don't look at much. But it has a profound impact on purchasing power throughout the whole economy. So when money concentrates at the top, the economy necessarily slows down.
Now that's a very important point. Can you say that capitalism works?
Yes and no. Capitalism works in terms of what capitalism sets out to do. That is, acquire wealth for the capitalists.
Right.
So in terms of its own goals, capitalism works. In terms of its own claims as to the results of this, it does not work. It does not produce universal prosperity. In fact, it produces exactly what we see it produce. We see it produce high levels of inequality. We see it erode the middle class. We see the rich acquiring a larger and larger share of everything, which, by the way, is economically unsustainable. Again, because of the velocity of money, they cannot keep the cycle of consumption going, and so society deteriorates. So capitalism does not work in terms of any rational economics.
It did, and some people are actually coming to that realization. Recently, there was an interview in Gawker, of all places, with Nick Hanauer, venture capitalist. I'm not sure if you saw that article, where he's a very wealthy man, and they asked him about employment, and of course, the title of it is "Defecation is going to hit the oscillation," more or less, a little cruder than that. And he says that, well, look, my message is that if wages go up, employment will go down. That whole idea is a scam. It's a con job. It's an intimidation tactic. There's no evidence whatsoever that it's true. Rather, if you have high wages, usually you find low unemployment. Right now, of course, the mainstream business theory would absolutely, oh, no, you have to have low wages to have high employment.
Yeah, because here's the theory that they're going on, that labor is a commodity like any other commodity, and like every commodity has a market clearing price. So especially for the radical libertarians, the Austrians, all unemployment is voluntary. There is no involuntary unemployment, because it merely means that you have refused to work for the market clearing price. And if that market clearing price is $2 an hour and you don't accept a job at $2 an hour, then you are voluntarily unemployed. But this is pure nonsense, because supply and the markets are run by supply and demand. At least monetary markets do. Markets in a money economy. Demand is reducible to wages. 80% of demand is going to come from wages. So when you reduce wages, you reduce demand. Okay. And not only that, it's as you said, if you look in every country, any country you care to name, where wages are high, you tend to have higher labor force participation rates, lower unemployment, whereas when wages are low, you have lower labor force participation rates, and you have higher unemployment. So the empirical data is all on the side of reasonable wages. Now, they are true. It has certain effects, things like jobs for teenagers. They probably do lose out. However, that's an easy adjustment to make to accommodate that. So things like, throwing newspapers that we all, men of my age, we all threw newspapers when we were young, and it was a sub-minimum wage job. But it was a great job for somebody who was, 13, 14, 15. That was a great starter job. And so minimum wages do tend to eliminate that kind of work. Further, it impacts employment in another way. The more expensive labor is, the more you have a spur to innovation. That is, the more you have a spur to substitute capital for labor. Okay, so higher wages are an impetus for science, for development, for engineering, things like that, all to get rid of the high labor cost. So, I mean, slave societies do not innovate. Slave societies are very technologically stable. Why? Because the labor's free. What's the point of labor-saving devices when the labor doesn't cost you anything but subsistence?
When you see that in ancient Egypt, where Hieron of Alexandria, one of the great inventors of the ancient world, he really understood scientific principles, and he discovered the steam engine. He discovered all the principles that make it work, but nobody really thought there was any point to it. Nobody would invest in him or give him grants of money to develop it because, hey, we got oodles of slaves here. The Ptolemy Greek rulers of ancient Greek Egypt, they said, we don't need this. We got slaves to do all our jobs. We don't need to be inventive here. So nobody funded it. They were more interested in having him design little temple tricks and things to deceive people when they walked into the temple.
Exactly. So technology becomes a toy.
Right.
Not an economic, an economic engine.
Yeah, precisely.
So the higher the wages, the more innovation you get. And so high wages and sort of the level of technological development go together. Matter of fact, there's a theory, there's always a question. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in England? Why not on the continent? Why not Germany or France or Italy, which after all before had been the economic powerhouses? Well, and the theory is that wages in England were relatively high and energy was relatively cheap because they had coal seams that were near the surface, easy to work, etc. So in those circumstances, it made sense to substitute capital for labor. Whereas on the continent, it was just the opposite. Energy was expensive. The coal seams had been worked out. And labor was cheap. So why substitute?
Exactly. Now, you talked a little bit before about the free market and the problem. Whereas if you have a free market, you can't have real capitalism. Is there such a thing as a free market? Because it seems to me that the market, like anything else, is a power structure, and whoever has the most wealth in the market necessarily controls the power structure, just like government.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, that's the guiding principle beneath distributism. The wider wealth is distributed, and by wealth we mean productive wealth, the means of production, as Marx would say. The wider that is distributed, the more free the market. Now, it's a funny thing. I used to have my students do an exercise. I used to require them to pick up an economic textbook, any economic textbook, and look up the definition of 3 terms in that textbook. Freedom, property, and free markets. Well, it was a snipe hunt because no economic textbook defines those things. Okay, so here you have a science that cannot define its most basic terms. And there's a reason they avoid definitions of that, because once you define those terms, the whole free market theory falls apart. Markets are relatively free or relatively unfree. You cannot have a pure free market because the market always depends on an order which it cannot itself create. It always depends on socialized services which the market cannot supply. So it doesn't matter how good you are at producing something. If there are no roads to take it to market, you won't be successful. If you had to pay for your own police protection, if you had to pay for, if you had to drill your own well, dig your own latrine, etc., you wouldn't have any time to do your business. So before you could have a market, you have to have all of these other services, which are prerequisites to the market, but which are not market goods. So the free market depends on socialized services. we tend to put the argument in between a pure socialism and a pure capitalism. Okay, and in fact, both are impossible. In order to have any kind of socialized services, you have to have some economic activity which is not socialized. Okay, in order to have that economic activity, you have to have infrastructures and social order and educated people, etc., all of which are not market goods. So there's an independent, there's not an opposition, there's only an opposition between the extremes, and those extremes never exist. Rather than an opposition, there is an interpenetration, there's a mutual dependence of markets and socialized services.
In other words, the individual is not prior to society.
Well, yeah.
As libertarians would have it.
The most absurd statement ever, as if there were an individual without, who created himself, who was without parents. But so far, I have not met this. I have not met this person. But,
now
they tell me it's everywhere.
Right. Libertarians will respond and say, well, you're not, when you talk about the abuses in capitalism and the problem, you're not actually attacking capitalism, you're attacking crony capitalism. All we need to do is just get government out of the way. Less government, and then we'll have free markets emerge. What could be wrong with that position? It sounds reasonable to the average person who hears it.
Yeah, so long as they don't know history, that works. The fact is, there is no capitalism apart from crony capitalism. Capitalism is always and everywhere a creation of the state. That is why the capitalists never, ever worry about somebody who complains about crony capitalism, so long as they're willing to maintain the idea of a pure capitalism somewhere. Because they know that pure capitalism will always be crony, and that the complaints about crony capitalism are no threat to them whatsoever. So long as the solution is supposed to be a pure capitalism. You know, we have a kind of blindness. Every attempt to create this pure capitalism results in a larger state. So if you look at what happened in England, say when the Liberal Party took over in 1832, two things you got immediately, were what we would call a centralized bank. Bank of England. Bank of England had existed, but now it became the Central Bank of England, and you got the poorhouse. Okay, why was the poorhouse necessary? The point of the poorhouse was to criminalize poverty and to get rid of the prior welfare system, the Speenham system, which is probably the most generous welfare system in the world because it guaranteed every worker a subsistence living. Well, people who had a subsistence living had no desire to work in the factories for 16 hours a day to get a subsistence living. So in other words, the Speenham system destroyed the labor market that the capitalists needed. So the solution was to end the Speenham and the welfare system and make welfare entirely dependent upon the workhouse. And the workhouse, the conditions were deliberately brutal. By law, the food at the workhouse could not be better than that afforded by the lowest wage. Families were broken up, so women went to one section, men to another, children to another. Okay, so families were tremendously anti-family. Poverty was criminalized, and people then had the choice of working in the factories or working in the poorhouse. And every other source of aid was criminalized. But that's the history of capitalism. It's always an exercise in state power. Always and everywhere. There is this pure capitalism that Mises talks about, or Rothbard. Just doesn't exist, hasn't existed, can't exist, and won't exist.
Well, they'll turn around and they'll say, well, whenever government regulates something, it's actually the corporations who do the regulating for the government's interest, and they'll use the government as an unfair advantage in the market. And experience shows us this is true. The banks lobbied and even wrote the legislation that became the Federal Reserve Act and created the Federal Reserve. The big agri lobbies always lobby for farm subsidies that benefit them and not really any small farmers. The insurance industry heavily influenced the Affordable Care Act in their favor. So what happens if things were set to zero, as it were, and government was not to regulate? Or, like the anarcho-libertarians would have it, you just got rid of government altogether.
Yes. Well, the anarcho-libertarian theory, which is pure libertarianism, forms a nice paradigm. Because if you really got rid of pure government, if you got rid of government, what you would get rid of is property. At least rentable property. You would get rid of economic rent. So Proudhon pointed out that property is always and everywhere a creation of government. Or rather, it would be more accurate to say the separation of ownership and use, that is economic rent, is always creation of government. Without government, you could only have as much property as you could actually physically use. So if you could farm 100 acres, you could have 100 acres. But you couldn't have 101 and then rent out 1 acre. People would just refuse to pay you the rent and use the land for themselves. So that's pure libertarianism. And its original name, by the way, was socialism. Socialism was originally an anti-status doctrine. It doesn't work out. It doesn't work out because without government, what you don't get is non-government, what you get is warlords. You get Somalia.
Right.
Okay. And for this reason, Marx called it romantic socialism. And he was going to replace it with scientific socialism, which was going to use the government to distribute, not distribute property, because he didn't believe in property, but to organize property into Soviet, what would become in Russia, Soviets. But property would, once they had achieved this state where property, where all the output went to the workers, then property would no longer be an issue, and the state would wither away, and we'd get to the Proudhon's end state scientifically, rather than through Proudhon's romanticism. I'm sorry, I forgot what the damn question was.
That's all right. No, you started actually in the right direction. So we were saying that if government, can't we just solve the problem by getting rid of government? Since whenever government tries to regulate, because oftentimes you'll see whenever there's a problem, we say regulation. And then then the government says, we'll regulate, but let's talk to the lobbyists first. So it seems like we have an unsolvable problem. That the government regulates, what that really means is the wealthiest businesses regulate, or the NGOs or whatever group through their lobbyists. On the other hand, if government doesn't regulate, then big business does whatever it wants anyway. So how does distributism solve that problem?
The reason they can do this is because power is concentrated. All right, when power is concentrated, then regulation will tend to be in favor of the people who have the power. That's just the way that works. So the distributist response is to distribute power by distributing property. So when you have large entities, they will control the government. When you have instead a lot of small entities, well, they will control the government too, but no one entity will have the power to direct government to its own will. And so by distributing economic power, you also distribute political power, because power follows property. Daniel Webster. Whoever has the property has the political power. The shibboleths of democracy notwithstanding, voting is an interesting exercise, but it will always depend on who can get funded. And the funding sources are very limited. So therefore, the state will become a servant of the corporations.
So the next question is, when we talk about distributism, very often, and we start the apologetic, people say, well, you're criticizing capitalism, so you must therefore be a socialist. Is there anything socialist about distributism?
Well, in the sense of state ownership of property,
Right.
the exact opposite of socialism. In socialism, you have no property. In distributism, everybody has their own property. Now, it's socialism in the sense of Proudhon, but not in the sense of Marx. It's and that is, oddly enough, it's socialism in the sense of libertarianism, but not in the sense of state capitalism.
Mention real quick who Proudhon was. Is one of the foundational figures of what generally might be called voluntarism in some cases, even though he wasn't consistent in that. But a lot of voluntarists claim him as kind of their source. Talk a little bit about Proudhon, just because the listeners probably have not heard of him before.
Yeah. What is it, Jean-Pierre Proudhon?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, he's a 19th century thinker, and he, like Marx, he noted, and like everybody, in fact, it was a big discussion in the 19th century among everybody, that the owners of property appropriated the lion's share of the output to themselves, thereby violating distributive justice. Okay, and this was not only a violation of justice, but a violation of economic order. In other words, there's never enough demand to clear the markets. So Proudhon traced the problem to property. Now, it's not true to say he was anti-property. I think it would be more true to say it was the separation of ownership and use. So if you got rid of government, you could no longer separate ownership and use. Therefore, everybody would have their own property. And more, Proudhon would say property would be evenly divided. Everybody would own exactly the same amount of property. But in such circumstances, then, if you got rid of the government, and then people locally would be able to self-organize, they would be able to put their property together to provide what common services were necessary, etc., etc. Marx is right, that is romantic. It's the other way around. Before property can be actualized, you need these social services. You need community is prior to property. So it's romantic in that sense, but it serves as a useful paradigm, I think. I mean, you couldn't possibly organize a society that way, but you could, I think, use it as a paradigm, if not a practical theory.
So now we talked about ownership of property, that there should be lots of ownership of property in the distributive society, not just any property, not some real estate venture, but productive property. Mm-hmm. Now, Thomas Woods, a Catholic libertarian for the von Mises Institute, he says, even granting the distributist premise that smaller businesses have been swallowed up by larger firms, it is by no means obvious that it is always preferable for a man to operate his own business rather than to work for another. It may well be that a man is better able to care for his family precisely if he does not own his own business or work the backbreaking schedule of running his own farm, partially because he's not ruined if the enterprise for which he works should have to close, and partially because he doubtless enjoys more leisure time that he can spend with his family than if he had the cares and responsibilities of his own business. Surely, therefore, we're dealing here with a matter for individual circumstances rather than the crude generalization. Unquote.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's absolutely right. Not everybody wants to be an owner. Not everybody wants to have his own business. There are room for people who don't want to be owners. And there's certain professions where ownership is not an issue, in the sense of, say, a university professor, a government employee, things like that. He doesn't want to be an owner of property in that sense. That still doesn't prevent the ownership from being distributed. So, for example, in employee-owned companies, which, by the way, I think the university properly understood needs to be understood as a guild of scholars, but that's another issue. So he's right, not everybody wants to be a capitalist, but everybody needs to have, in their work, they need to have some sense of ownership. So that may be through participation in properties, through having cooperative ownership for the workers, etc. Not everybody needs to be an independent owner, but collectively we all need to own the means of production in society. And even for government workers, so for example in northern Italy, in Emilia Romagna, the majority of services are delivered through worker-owned cooperatives. And it's the one place in Italy where government works, in the sense where people are actually satisfied with government services.
Which is saying a lot in Italy.
It's saying a hell of a lot in Italy. I mean, it would even be saying something in the United States, but it really is saying something in Italy. So the Woods is setting up a false dichotomy. You know, everybody is owner of a small business, and nobody or only a few owning business. If you look at it that way, he's right. And if those were the only two possibilities, he would be right. But obviously, those are not the only two possibilities. If there are millions, basically a billion people working in the distributed economy. So clearly, Woods' dichotomy is a false dichotomy.
Indeed. Distributism takes its cue, as we noted, from the principles of justice in the Greek tradition, and from the moral teaching of the popes and the social encyclicals, preeminently Rerum Novarum, Quadragesimo Anno and Laborem Exercens of John Paul II, the first two being of Leo XIII and Pius XI, respectively. Now, on the other hand, libertarian Catholics such as Woods and many others, the Acton Institute, Father Zusseldorf, figures that are ubiquitous on the internet, they say economics is a science, and the church cannot authoritatively teach on economics or bind men's consciences to their teaching. And you see that coming out, of course, with the recent encyclical and the condemnation of globalism in the encyclical. And immediately they came out, Father Z had, well, sometimes popes are right, sometimes popes are wrong. Can the Pope authoritatively teach us morally on the principles that govern our behavior in the market?
Well, let's start. This is a misunderstanding of science. All right. There are sciences which the Pope has no particular expertise on and no reason to comment. These are the physical sciences, which deal with physical matter, number, weight, extension, things like that. These are matters of calculation. Economics, however, is a humane science. And the humane science always deals with relationships between persons and the community, between the community and God, etc. Relationships are always governed in the natural order by the virtue of justice, and in the supernatural order by the virtue of caritas. Okay, and these are areas in which the Pope is the authority. You cannot have an economy without justice, and therefore economics falls under the guidance of the moral law, and hence it is a matter upon which the Pope can comment. All right, and even make rulings. All right, he's not an expert in the velocity of money or the things like that. He's not an expert, and they generally, in fact, they never comment on things like that. They leave those to the experts. But prior to those things is the virtue of justice, because it is a humane science. There was a big shift. It occurred in 1891, which some will recognize as a significant year, when we went from political economy to pure economics. Political economy was the idea that the economy is always embedded in social and political structures. You don't find, there is no pure economics. Then in 1891, with the publication of Marshall's The Principles of Economics, and that's the first time that word is used like that. The idea that economics was a pure science, divorced from culture, divorced from politics, divorced from the social order, divorced from the moral order. It was just pure number. Okay. That was when economics went off the rails. And only under that mindset can you talk in the way that Woods talks. But in fact, it's impossible to understand any economics without understanding the political and social order that produces that economics. And vice versa, it's impossible to understand any political order without understanding its economic base. So Marshall separated politics and economics. But he didn't end up with two new sciences. He ended up with two crippled disciplines, neither of which can understand the events within their own domains, because in fact, there's only one domain, okay, with two different aspects. And so a political theorist who doesn't understand economics is crippled, whereas an economist who doesn't understand the political, social, and cultural base is crippled. Neither of them will be able to describe events in their realm. And that's the situation we have to see today, and we have to get back. We have to get away from this pure economics that Woods talks about and back to the idea of a political economy.
So we spoke earlier about wages, and it's a dictum in the business world that wages are the first, most easily controllable expense of business. So you detail in your first book, The Vocation of Business, that in the year 2000, the average CEO made 531 times that of the workers in his company. And I experienced this when I used to be an assistant manager at Walmart. And one of the things that said, I've got to get out of this place. It's not even just the negative impact I saw in the community and different things like that, but I just looked at, the money going to Bentonville in profit versus what's being paid out, and I just did some numbers, and I realized it would have been incredible. They could easily double everyone's wage and still be sending incredible amounts of money out. And that's why I decided, all right, I got to get out of this place. But is it efficient that CEOs make this much, as is often claimed, right? Because they say, well, they have to make it. Hey, shareholders want to pay them, otherwise they won't direct the company well, and so necessarily you have to pay CEOs that much. Is it necessary and is it efficient that they pay CEOs that much?
Well, that question can be answered empirically, because there have been times when they weren't paid that much. Also, you can compare it cross-culturally to salaries in Europe or Japan, and you find that there really is no justification for it. None whatsoever. Furthermore, you can compare it to our own history. And if anything, firms in the 50s and the 60s, the economy was growing faster, firms were growing faster. By whatever measure you care to take, price-earnings ratios, etc., etc., you see that no, there is no argument from efficiency here. It's at least not in the data. It's purely abstract. And you can even see it by comparing Sam's Club to Costco. Okay, two firms in the same business, but with a different attitude towards wages. Costco pays a living wage, pays very good wages. Okay, Walmart, Sam's Club pays very poor wages. And yet Costco has a higher return to capital, higher per store, per employee numbers, etc., etc. So there is simply no justification in fact or in theory for these salaries which the CEOs collect. So why do they collect them? Because they can. Wages, as Adam Smith recognized, wages are not set by productivity. Wages are set by power. The wage contract, like all contracts, is a power relationship. So, The CEO gets 500 times what the worker gets, not because he is 500 times more productive, but because he is 500 times more powerful. The seamstress in a sweatshop gets a pittance, not because her production is low, but because her power is pitiful. So wage contracts arbitrate power, not productivity.
Now, how do we change the system? For example, Father Sirico, in his book Defending the Free Market, he argues that, well, it's a normal thing for CEOs to have high wages because look at what happened to Ben & Jerry's. They tried to get a CEO to work for a wage just slightly higher than what the average people in the management structure were making, which is itself slightly higher than what the workers were making. They couldn't get anybody to take the job, and eventually they sold out to a Dutch firm. So he points to that as evidence that it's natural for CEOs to have wages because that's what the market demands.
Well, again, this is empirically refuted. If you can look at any number of places where the CEO makes a good living, he'll make 10 or 20 times what the workers make. If you look at something like Mondragon Worker Cooperative, the CEO makes 9 times what the worker makes, what the lowest paid worker makes. Okay, this is a better incentive. Because if your CEO's wage is 9 times what the lowest worker makes, a lot of your thought process is, how can I improve his wage? Because if I improve his wage $1, I improve mine $9. You see? So you see, this is a different psychology. Now the psychology is, how can I depress that guy's wage? Because I get to keep everything that he gives up. See, the best way to analyze firms is in terms of incentives. Where's the incentive? If the incentive is to screw the worker, well, that's what's going to get done. And if the incentive is to prove his lot, well, that's what's going to get done. That's the way human incentives work.
Indeed. Next question. Do workers have a just share, that is, in question of justice, in the fruits of their labor? That is, in a living wage, or an ESOP, or some other type of worker ownership arrangement? How do we even determine a just wage?
Yeah. Now, again, this goes back to, I think, the division between economics and political economy. For the economists, said, well, if you're going to have a just wage, you have to have some way of calculating a just wage. And it turns out they're right. There's no way to calculate a just wage that's just in all circumstances. It turns out the just wage is not a number. It's not $9.11 an hour. It's not 17.62 cents an hour. Just wage is a judgment and a standard of judgment. And you can determine that a society generally has a just wage when you look around and you see 4 conditions fulfilled. 1, that workers and their families are living at a level of dignity that is appropriate to that society. That's going to be different, obviously, in the United States than it is in Bangladesh, but they all have an appropriate level that they consider a dignified life. 2, they can do this without working undue hours. So if they're working 100 hours a week to reach this level, you know that the wage is not just. If they do this because they have to put their wives and children out to work, then you know that the wage is not just. 3, they can attain this level of dignity without undue reliance on government support. So they're not getting subsidies from the government, etc. And 4, they can do it without reliance on consumer credit, that is, on usury. So if you get those 4 conditions, you may not be able to calculate a number, but you can look around and make a reasonable judgment that the wages are or not just. Okay. Now, there's another standard you use. Can the market be cleared by wages? If markets are not being cleared by wages, 2 things happen. 3 things. There's charity, but that's never significant. But you find, first, usury. The people with an excess of funds lend it to the people with a deficiency of funds, and that helps to clear markets. And the second thing you get is the growth of government, because government then becomes the consumer of last resort. So you have high government expenditures because they're necessary to clear the markets. So the government spends a lot of money. Usually, the thing the government most likes to spend money on is the military. So you tend to get a militarized society, but you get a statist society because you have to. You can't clear the markets. There's just not enough purchasing power to clear the markets, so the government grows. This is why, over the last 50 years especially, government expenditures have grown so much, and grown as much or more under conservative governments as they have under liberal governments, because it's necessary. There's no other choice. If you're not clearing the market from wages, you've got to clear the market through government.
Indeed. So now capitalism touts that its modern industrial economy has vastly increased the wealth of society by churning out ever more goods at lower prices. But low prices often come with hidden costs, apart from the cost in the labor market and communities. Not just, but in regard to their quality. So is it good for society? That is it just that we have all sorts of goods at low quality that one can pick up at the box stores and render quality goods almost unaffordable to most people, and such as in the developing world, for instance? How does distributism improve the quality but keep prices affordable for the mean of society?
Yes. That's I like when you say, well, if it's good for society, that is it just? I think you got the nexus there, that what is going to be good is generally going to be that which is just. The problem is confusing price and cost. Right. So if the prices at Walmart are extremely low, why? Because they don't pay all the costs. So you have all of these externalized costs, which don't show up in the price but are paid in other ways, usually through taxes, through subsidies, or through human misery. All right. So, for example, let's take the Walmart model, the Walmart distribution model. From an engineering point, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to take low-valued goods, ship them from the interior of China to Shanghai, getting them on a boat, shipping them to Long Beach, getting them on a train, shipping them to Bentonville, getting them on a truck, shipping them out to their distribution centers. From an engineering standpoint, that's just, pardon me, effing nuts. It makes no sense, but it's profitable. Why is it profitable? Because Walmart doesn't pay the shipping expense, because the roads are subsidized. All right. Without the subsidized highway system, if trucking had to pay its own costs, the Walmart model would disappear in a moment. Furthermore, they're buying goods that are subject not only to human misery in China, but are subject to currency manipulation. So the renminbi is kept artificially low and the dollar is kept artificially high. So you have this implied subsidy, and that artificial subsidy works out to be an export subsidy. An artificial manipulation of currency is in effect an export subsidy. So, among many other things, the cost of transportation is not included. The cost of the export subsidy is not included. It doesn't show up in the price. It's paid in other ways. You'll find that, I tell my students, that 3/4 of all problems in social justice are cost accounting problems. Okay. Once you account for all the costs, right, you'll find that you'll easily identify the problem in pure economic terms. If you allocated all the costs of Walmart to Walmart, Walmart would just dry up and blow away. And Benton, Arkansas will go back to being a village.
Indeed. But then the anarcho-libertarians would turn around and say, well, then it's simple. The solution is private ownership of roads, because then the trucking has to pay its own tolls, and the market will adjust naturally for what the roads can bear.
Right, they will. They will. Problem is, roads are a natural monopoly. What would happen is that the owner of the road would in fact become the economic czar. All right, roads are a common good, not a market good. You cannot have a competitive system of roads. Right? Nobody's going to build two roads along the same route and let them compete. And even if they did, that would only be two roads. That would be an oligarchy, not a free market. Assuming you could build the roads without government support in the terms of being able to seize the property, being able to seize the right-of-way. Without eminent domain. Even assuming that were possible, which it's not, what you would have is a choke point in the economy. And the owners of the roads would demand not enough just to pay their costs. They would demand an ever-increasing share of the commerce that was on that road. Believe me, Walmart would never allow a system of private roads. But neither would any other sensible person, because you would create, in effect, an economic monopoly. As happened with the railroads, for example.
I was just going to bring that up because then Walter Block, for example, has a whole bunch of models by which he touts that private ownership of the roads would work, and necessarily you wouldn't have monopolies developing. I forget his argument actually at the moment, but so he argues that. But let's go into the railroads, because that was an example of a common good that was grabbed by government, given to private individuals who ran it as a monopoly. What happened to business and the market at that time?
The railroads are an interesting case, because what happens is that railroads are tremendous capital investment. And this always happens when you have a high capital investment at risk. They move to set prices in a monopolistic way. So what the railroads did is they established what was called the Rate Bureau. And the Rate Bureau set the rates for all railroads. It was a it was exactly what happens in absence of government. The Rate Bureau didn't, of course, have legal authority to do this, but they had economic power to do it. So any railroad that didn't charge the rates that were set by the Rate Bureau the other railroads would threaten the banks that finance them. Look, if you keep lending to this railroad, we'll pull all our money out of your bank. So things like that. They were able to discipline their members to charge exactly what the Rate Bureau told them to charge. So now the Rate Bureau was taken over by the government to become the Interstate Commerce Commission. Okay, because obviously users of the railroad had no voice in the Rate Bureau. Another interesting thing about the railroads as a monopoly, you get the case of Jay Gould. Jay Gould controlled the Erie Railroad that went from the Pennsylvania Railroad, went from western Pennsylvania into New York City. So he had a monopoly on that traffic. And he wanted to leverage that monopoly into other kinds of monopolies, particularly on building supplies, because New York was growing very, very fast at that time. So, take one case, the Pennsylvania Bluestone Company. He told the Pennsylvania Bluestone Company that unless they sold out to him, he was not going to carry their goods. Okay. Now, there was no other way for this company to get their goods to market. He just refused to load their freight. And so they went bankrupt, and he bought them up at pennies on the dollar. Right? You see, this is how what Bloch would call a free market. That's how a free market in Bloch's terms actually works. That's not a free market, it's a controlled market. It's a socialistic market, but the socialists are all private enterprise. So that disappeared, that power disappeared when, with the imposition of an old Roman law, the common carrier rule. under the common carrier rule, if you hold yourself forth as a common carrier, as a carrier of freight, you have to accept all freight without prejudice that is properly presented at your dock. Okay. Now, which market is more free? The market where Gould, as private owner, can say, well, I'm free to carry goods or not carry goods. That's freedom, right? Or the market under the government regulation of the common carrier rule, in which you have to accept all freight, thereby violating your freedom. Well, your freedom may be limited, but the market's freedom is expanded. So consumers get more choice because all freight has to be loaded. Entrepreneurs get more opportunity because they know if they produce something, railroads got to carry it. So I would say that the government-regulated market is more free than the so-called free market, where Jay Gould can tell you what you're going to produce, how you're going to produce it, what you're going to sell it at, and what quantity you're going to do it in.
And you can't tell him to get lost because he has the power in the market. So if you want to produce goods and you want to sell them, you have to do it on his terms.
That's right. Unless you agree to his terms, you must go out of business. That is not freedom.
Often writers who argue in favor of distributism say that for the ownership society, where men own their own businesses, everyone should be, his own owner, and own production. Not every distributist writer puts it in those terms, but most say, the ideal is that the majority of society would have productive property. But there's some kinds of production that they can't be managed by one or two people. Computers come to mind because there's vastly expensive machines that create transistors with tiny parts that are almost microscopic that are putting together these microchips. You couldn't produce that by hand. And other things, you could produce a car here and there, but could one or two people produce cars for general consumption? Probably not. Although 3D printing might change that. We've seen 3D printed cars and things like that. But nevertheless, how does distributism solve the problem of the division of labor and ownership in situations where the production is just too complex for one person?
Yeah, well, we can see how it solves it in places like Mondragon or in Emilia Romagna. You have extremely large enterprises making extremely sophisticated products. As a matter of fact, precisely the products they're talking about through cooperative ownership. So it's not true that distributism means everybody has their own business, but everybody has the share in the business they have. That's what distributism is. So there will be a lot more private owners, but there will also be a lot more cooperative enterprises, which are quite capable of turning out goods of arbitrary complexity. So whether it's microelectronics or airliners, there is no distributism. Cooperative ownership is scalable from the smallest enterprise to the largest. So you can have huge industrial concerns like Mondragon, which are cooperatively owned, just as you can have small mom and pop operations which are cooperatively owned. So it's eminently scalable. But you brought up the question of things like 3D printing. One of the original justifications for capitalism was that this machinery that we had was so expensive that you needed vast piles of capital to keep the economy going. That is no longer true. The cost of machinery has gone down by orders of magnitude. And the greatest example of distributed production, if not distributed ownership, though, is modern business. Why do we have globalism? We have globalism precisely because you no longer need these huge piles of capital to produce high-quality goods. Okay? You can, therefore, since the amounts of capital are relatively small, you can distribute production throughout the world. Okay? Into poorly capitalized factories. Without that, if the capitalists claim that you needed these piles of capital were true, you would not have that kind of globalism we have. But since machinery is now so cheap, you can have distributed production. Now, the distributed producers right now are being played off against one another So if Bangladesh will drive down its wages sufficient to please the people at the Disney Corporation, they'll just move it to Vietnam, or they'll move it to Indonesia, they'll move it to wherever. They can play these small producers off against each other. But one day they're going to wake up and they're going to say, why are we doing this? Okay, we're making something for $1 that they sell in the United States for $50. Okay, why don't we make it ourselves, pay our people twice as much, sell it for $2 here where everybody can afford it, and tell Disney to go to hell. Tell Walmart to go to hell. Tell Adidas and Nike to go to hell. It requires they just simply ignore the patent laws and the copyright laws, which they do in China already, and just start producing for local markets rather than for global markets. So that, I think, is something that is increasing and will increase and will slowly replace the capitalist system that we have now.
And there's an important thing, too, is that technology is always a force multiplier for change in the economy. And now capitalism, sometimes critics of capitalism say, oh, well, and every time, they destroy, it destroys all these jobs every time, like saddle makers, for example, when the automobile hit critical mass and things of that nature. Yet, necessarily technology must move. And so wouldn't it be a fault in capitalism that it centralizes all the labor into factories, into these places? Then when the factory goes bust, then all the people lose their jobs. Rather than if you had an ownership society, people can be gradually updating their technology. They can pay insurance into a guild type of structure that assists its members in acquiring new technology. And so people can continue to keep their jobs and not have to face, all right, pick up, move somewhere else. You don't have to uproot from your community every time the technology changes.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Not only that, capitalism is not, despite what you've heard, all of that innovative. In fact, the Middle Ages were extremely innovative. The medieval man believed he lived in a marvelous age of machinery. So if you look at the Doomsday Book of, what was it?
William the Conqueror.
Yeah, 1086.
Mm-hmm.
William took inventory. And he found within his domain, his new domain, 5,600 mills. And believe me, that only covers about half of England. So they had, and these mills were used for grinding grain, they were used for fulling wool, they were used for bellows and hammers in metallurgy, in brewing. So medieval man thought he lived in an age of wonderful, marvelous machinery, because he did.
And it was incredibly complex, too, because, you're either harnessing water, you're harnessing wind, you have all kinds of complicated gears and interlocking mechanisms that all have to be made by hand. It was a very complicated endeavor, which, of course, meant a very large investment. So people had a sense of this, they had a sense of the technology. And you look at their iconography, they depict, for example, Christ with a compass measuring out the world to create. They conceive it in entirely mechanical, scientific terms, contrary to what we usually hear about medievals.
Right. A very good book is Jean Gimpel, I think it is, The Medieval Machine, which is very good on the technology of the Middle Ages, which turned out to be a very high and very sophisticated technology indeed, and very, very progressive. And they could do that because they didn't have patent laws. Patent laws actually restrict development, okay, because knowledge builds on knowledge. If you restrict the use of knowledge, you get less innovation. But I think I was in the telephone business for many years, and the transition from the old click and bang systems with the rotary dial systems to the digital systems, the touch tone systems. Well, in fact, the phone companies were very, very slow to go to touch tone. Why? Because they had this huge investment in the old kick and bang systems. And these things were huge, hugely expensive, whereas the new systems were incredibly cheap. So they deliberately slowed down because they were a monopoly. They slowed down the pace of innovation. Even though the touch-tone system lowered their costs, they charged you more for having a touch-tone phone. Why? Because they didn't want too many people buying them. All right? They wanted to limit its introduction until they could depreciate out their existing investment in click and bang. So they slowed down the pace of innovation. And that's a common paradigm throughout business. When you have these huge investments, you don't want to see innovation. You want to do everything you can to stop innovation, at least innovation you don't control. So the idea that you need capitalism for innovation simply is not historically correct.
So now, we asked earlier, does capitalism work? Now, does distributism work? And you mentioned a few examples, Emilia, Romagna in Italy, and Mondragon. Tell us a little bit about Mondragon, how it works. Emilia, Romagna, if you can, and other examples of distributism or distributist policies that are working today.
Yes. Well, if you look at Mondragon, probably the most famous example, although not by any means the only example, but it's right now about 80,000 worker owners. That's the third largest corporation in Spain, highly diversified corporation. It begins in the 1950s in the devastation following the Spanish Civil War in the Basque country. The Basques were on the losing side, and Franco was not a forgiving man. It was just not part of his makeup, and he punished the Basques. And one of the ways he punished them was refusing to give them business licenses. Right. So into the situation steps this priest, Don Jose Maria Arizmendi Arrieta, a Basque priest. And he's well steeped in distributism and in Catholic social teaching. And what he does is he first establishes, his first job is to establish a Basque cultural center. He realized culture is prior, and an educational center. He encourages some of his students to become engineers. All right, they become engineers, and he encourages them to establish a cooperative. Now, they can't do that when there's no legal form, and two, they can't get a business license. So they buy up a firm, a failing firm, that makes paraffin stoves. Okay, and the reason for buying it is just to get the business license. They're not interested in the stoves, they're interested in the license. So they buy this firm, they set it up as a cooperative, and it immediately starts to grow. They had to raise the capital initially from small contributions. And since that initial capital, they've never needed a dollar of outside money. What they did, and here's Don Jose's brilliance, Don Jose insisted they establish a bank, the Caja Laboral. And using the bank, they recycled their own money into new enterprises, into new cooperatives. All right? So today, as I say, these 80,000 worker owners in industry, in finance, in retailing, in I think in farming as well, or at least processing, and it's all worker owned. All right, and the thing that made it work was control of their own finances, recycling the money through their own bank. Now, think about it, Mondragon. It has its own educational system, its own schools run on a cooperative model, right up to Mondragon University. It has its own social safety network. Initially, the Spanish government wouldn't let the Mondragon workers participate in the social security system. Well, because that's only for workers, and you're owners, so you can't be in the system. I said, fine, we'll establish our own. And they did. Their own social safety network. Unemployment insurance, that sort of thing. Okay? They did all of that without government. So, oddly enough, the Mondragon, they established their own Language training institutes are very important in a Basque country. They establish their own R&D centers. They establish their own management schools, things like that. It is a complete social system, apart from government. That is to say, it is the nearest thing in captivity to a libertarian system. All done without libertarians. So if you look at Emilia Romagna now, Mondragon is a very hierarchical organization. Anybody familiar with the business, corporate business chart will immediately recognize the business chart of Mondragon. Emilia Romagna, on the other hand, is a network system. It consists of thousands of small firms. Okay, and there's some coordination service centers, the IRVIT centers, things like that, which help with purchasing, with accounting, with bidding, international trade, and things like that. What happens in Emilia Romagna is that when they want to bid then on a contract, a number of these firms will get together. One will be the lead firm, okay, and they'll bid on the contract, okay, and then on the next contract will be another combination of firms. And so there's there's a system of internal sort of favors, you might say. Well, okay, you're going to be the lead firm on this contract, I'll be the lead firm on the next contract. It's not a contractual relationship, it's just sort of a customary relationship. That's just the way things work. And, a firm that wouldn't go along with these customs would just sort of be frozen out of things. So there's a sort of social discipline rather than a market discipline. And so that works in an entirely different way. You can look at something like the ESOPs in America, Springfield Remanufacturing Company. Established a very good book is Jack Stack's A Stake in the Outcome, about how he built up through employee ownership the Springfield Remanufacturing Company, an amazingly successful company, all right, built on a failing division of International Harvester. They bought up this failing company, and through worker ownership, they made it tremendously successful. You can look at something like Ricardo Semler's Semco. Semler inherited this company from his father. He wasn't interested in running it. So he said, well, I'll let the workers run it. Okay. And when he said he let the workers run it, he was serious. I mean, they run the whole company. They set their own wages. They set their own work hours. They set their own goals, etc., etc. They hire their own bosses. So if you're going to get your job, you're going to interview with the bosses, and they'll pass judgment on you. In Semco, it's the other way around. You want to be a manager at Semco, the workers interview you. Decide whether you're the kind of guy they want to work for,
Sounds like a recipe for anarchy.
Well, exactly.
My kind of thing.
Except that it turns out to be highly, highly effective. And this firm has tremendous growth, just tremendous growth, from a firm that was nearly failing when he took it over.
Well, it sounds like the principle of spontaneous order, and you see it in cities where the lights go, the traffic lights go out, and people start carefully managing their movements with each other so as not to hit anybody, and you have a sort of order that appears that the managed traffic lights can't create.
Yeah, managed traffic lights, that's a whole other thing. There's traffic lights are there to discipline us. It turns out we don't need this discipline. So any number of actual physical examples, if you replace the traffic lights with roundabouts, traffic moves a lot faster.
Right.
The thing about traffic lights is you no longer need to think. The only time you need to think is when the light turns yellow. Then you have this moment of panic. Speed up, slow down, speed up, slow down. That's the only time you need to think.
Right. And they've done examples, too, where if they take away the traffic lights, and they've done it in England, they've done it in the Netherlands, they've done it in a few other countries, in certain places, not the whole, sadly, not the whole country, but if they take the lights out, then all of a sudden accidents go down. Or if they have one, it's someone who's out of town, is not used to the system, makes a mistake. otherwise, it at times go through. There's this one fellow, I can't remember his name, but I'll link it in the notes. I'll find it. He does this movement. It's called Roads Fit for People, and he did a video in England. This one place that had traffic. There's only one main road that goes through town. Traffic's always backed up. All the people coming away from work, to and from, in this one suburb. Well, when they got rid of the traffic lights, it was 20-minute wait times getting through this light, basically. They got rid of the traffic light, the same people got through about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that example, but it did another thing, too. What they did was erase the boundaries between the street and the sidewalk. And it turns out that the pedestrian traffic moved as well. What the road had done was kill the business district because people couldn't cross the street easily. Okay, we're reluctant to cross the street easily. They erased the boundaries, and town life came back. Okay? You have to understand, you stay on the sidewalk, you don't walk on the street. That was a culturally enforced norm, okay, that goes back to the 20s and the 30s. And it required a big advertising campaign to get people to stop walking in the streets, because before then, pedestrians and vehicles, carriages, had equal rights to the street. Right? So that's where you got what they call jaywalking and laws against jaywalking. What does jaywalking mean? Well, a jay was a country person, a rube, a person who just wasn't sophisticated enough to live in the city.
A rusticus.
Exactly. So this, you had to enforce, not so much through law, or through this advertising campaign about jaywalking. And this jaywalking is just a slogan to get people to stick to the sidewalk. And it turns out it's not that good. It doesn't, if anything, it slows down traffic. When everybody's has a regard for everybody else. Traffic moves better, community moves better, business moves better, because you're not isolated to the business to the traffic on one side of the street. It just works out better. But it was a socially enforced norm. It was not, we accept it, we don't even think about it right now. In fact, had to work to get to that situation.
We'll have to work to get out of it. So, to close, what can we do to get more distributives in places like the United States or Great Britain, or in other countries? As we mentioned, of course, the Mondragon example on how that came in the Basque Country, Emilia Romagna in Italy, which has traditions of following Catholic social teaching in opposition to communism, especially in the North. But what can we do in America, say, where you're either capitalist or you're socialist? And if you're the latter, you're an evil red commie that needs to be purged from society. Otherwise, you're a good stars and stripes capitalist. How do we work beyond, try to get beyond these artificial barriers to real progress in the economy and in labor?
Yeah, well, I think what's going to happen is that we will do that because we have to do it. Capitalism has achieved an almost total victory. And total victory is almost always the predecessor of total defeat. The capitalists are not smart enough to run an economy. They can't even run their own companies without government support. So things are deteriorating. They're no longer able to employ the majority of people at a wage sufficient to guarantee a decent life. They're no longer able to generate the tax revenues to support the infrastructure. They're no longer able to protect the environment. They're no longer, right now, production isn't providing the profits to business, finances. So more and more the whole system is coming apart. As the system begins to come apart, people discover ways to solve their own problems, to grow their own food, to distribute energy production. So I don't pay an electric bill. I've got a PV system on my roof. I could, in theory, with a set of batteries, go off-grid. People will find ways to solve their own problems at the local level. When government and industry can no longer meet our needs, we'll willy-nilly be forced to find ways to cooperate with each other and meet our own needs. I think the most important economic resource will be neighborliness. That will be the scarce commodity. If you look around any neighborhood, you probably have enough tools for a fairly respectable machine shop or woodworking shop. Now, when people find they can get things done by cooperating, they'll become more and more reliant on their neighbors and less reliant on people in New York and Washington and Beijing to meet their own needs. And I think what you'll see is this kind of process of isomorphing. You'll maintain the appearance of a capitalist system. Well, actually, isomorphing is where a thing changes, it retains the same form but becomes something entirely different. So if you think of petrified wood, a piece of wood which so slowly is replaced by minerals, okay, so that in the end it's a rock, but it looks like a piece of wood, but it's no longer wood. Or you have grass in the sidewalk. So you have grass growing up in the sidewalk and you come back a few seasons later, there's no sidewalk anymore. It just disappeared under the grass. That's isomorphing. And so I think the economy will isomorph into a more distributed model, which is a more natural model anyway. And so think of distributism as the grass, and the capitalism as the concrete sidewalk, which is cracking. And so I think, so what do you need? You need a skill. You need to be able to do something useful to your neighbors. You need to know how to, I don't know, fix cars or washing machines. You need to know how to grow tomatoes. You need to have a skill which is useful to your neighbors. Oddly enough, that won't be a skill like personnel management. It won't be a skill like marketing manager. All of these useless jobs we have, which are only useful in the context of capitalism, but really don't add anything to human happiness. We'll have to develop real skills. We'll have to discover that we have a pair of hands, okay? They're capable of making things. So we'll use the resources we have to solve the problems that we have. And I think this is an inevitable process. And if you look at places like India or even China, if you look all around the world, you find people already doing this. If you look at the United States, you'll find people already doing this. But it always is invisible at the first. So if you want to be part of the new economy, learn how to make something. Learn how to do something. Learn how to provide a service that your neighbor might need. And then you'll find out he has skills which you need. So he'll rewire your house and you'll fix his plumbing. Whatever. That's, I think, what's going to happen, because once the capitalists win, they lose. You're incompetent. Yeah.
Indeed. So where can people go to find more of your work?
Well, it's available at Kindle and Amazon and fine bookstores everywhere. Well, actually, it's not so much in bookstores. So you probably order it. But you can order Toward a Truly Free Market, a distributist perspective, which is what I try to do in that book is lay out the economic case for distributism, the purely economic case. Chesterton and Belloc were good at laying out the political and the moral and the cultural case for distributism. They were less interested in the economic case, but there is a perfectly valid economic case which restores political economy to its centrality, and that's the point I try to make in Toward a Truly Free Market. So thank you for the opportunity to plug the book.
No, certainly. And this was excellent. I really appreciate that. And I think the important thing is solutions, not just, okay, well, capitalism stinks, capitalism ain't working, and blah, blah, blah. What do we do about it? And that's what I think is really the import of discussions like this and solutions like what are in your book. So, John Medaille, thank you for your time today.
Ryan, thank you.